You wake up at 3 a.m., heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Something chased you. Something you can't quite remember but can absolutely still feel. You reach for your phone, check the time, maybe scroll for a few minutes to shake the feeling, and eventually drift back to sleep. Now imagine that same jolt of terror. But there's no phone to check, no glowing screen to distract you, no streetlights outside your window, just you, the absolute darkness of a world with no electricity, and the very real possibility that something out there in that darkness actually could kill you. For most of human history, a nightmare wasn't just an unsettling dream. It was something to be taken seriously. A message, a warning, sometimes even an attack. So how did ancient humans actually cope with the terror that visits us in our sleep? Here's what's fascinating. Ancient people didn't have therapists, sleep specialists, or dream journals from a self-help app. And yet, across wildly different cultures that never had contact with each other, they independently developed strikingly similar tools to deal with bad dreams. Rituals, symbols, prayers, and protective objects that, in many cases, worked. Some of these ancient nightmare treatments were pure superstition. Others, as we'll see, accidentally stumbled onto psychological techniques that modern therapists still use today. Let's step into the dark and find out how our ancestors fought back against the monsters in their sleep. 1. Nightmares as real threats. The ancient worldview. To understand how ancient humans dealt with nightmares, you first have to understand how differently they experienced them. For most of us today, a nightmare is just a dream, an unpleasant but harmless misfire of the brain. That distinction, just a dream, is a relatively modern one. For most ancient cultures, dreams, good or bad, were not separate from reality. They were considered a genuine extension of it. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest civilizations we have written records from, nightmares were often believed to be the work of malevolent spirits or demons who could cross over into the sleeping mind and cause real harm. The ancient Egyptians believed something similar but more complex. They saw sleep as a temporary journey into the underworld, a liminal space where the soul could be genuinely vulnerable to hostile forces. A nightmare wasn't a random firing of neurons, it was evidence that something dangerous had gotten close. This meant nightmares weren't dismissed with a shrug the next morning. They were investigated, interpreted, and, crucially, defended against. 2. Reading the warning dream interpretation. If a nightmare was a real message, the first job was figuring out what it meant. Dream interpretation is one of the oldest documented practices in human history, and it shows up almost everywhere ancient writing survives. The Egyptians kept what are essentially some of the world's oldest dream dictionaries. Papyrus scrolls listing specific dream symbols and their meanings falling could mean one thing, drowning another, being chased by an animal, something else entirely. Specially trained priests, sometimes called masters of the secret things, were consulted to interpret unsettling dreams and advise on what ritual action needed to follow. In ancient Mesopotamia, we have entire cuneiform tablets, the Assyrian dream book cataloging thousands of dream scenarios and their supposed real-world consequences. If you dreamed of your teeth falling out, that meant one specific fate. If you dreamed of flying, another. The ancient Greeks took this even further by building entire temples dedicated to dream healing. At sites sacred to the healing god Asclepius, people suffering from nightmares or illness would undergo a ritual called incubation, sleeping inside the temple itself in hopes the god would visit them in a dream and either heal them directly or reveal what needed to be done. The common thread across all of these traditions, a nightmare wasn't something to just endure. It demanded interpretation, and interpretation demanded action. 3. Building defenses, protective objects, and symbols. Once you know what a nightmare means, the next step is stopping it from happening again. And this is where ancient humans got remarkably creative. Across the ancient Near East, small clay figures and amulets meant to ward off nightmare-causing demons were incredibly common. In Mesopotamia specifically, people would place small clay statues of protective spirits at the head and foot of the bed, believed to physically guard the sleeper through the night. In ancient Egypt, protective amulets, often depicting gods like bees, a fierce dwarf god specifically associated with protecting sleepers, particularly children, from nightmares and evil spirits, were placed near beds or worn during sleep. Bes was deliberately depicted as ugly and monstrous looking, on the theory that he'd be frightening enough to scare off whatever else might be lurking. Fast forward to indigenous cultures in North America, and you find one of the most famous nightmare defense objects in the world, the dreamcatcher. Originating with the Ojibwe people A dreamcatcher's woven web was believed to filter incoming dreams, catching bad dreams in its web where they'd be destroyed by the morning light, while good dreams slipped through the center hole and drifted gently down to the sleeper. In parts of medieval Europe, people hung specific herbs above their beds. Items like St. John's wort or mistletoe were believed to have protective properties against nightmare, sometimes tied specifically to warding off a hag or nightmare spirit believed to sit on a sleeper's chest, which is actually where the modern word nightmare comes from. 4. Words as weapons, prayers and incantations. Objects alone weren't always considered enough. Across nearly every ancient culture, specific verbal formulas, prayers, chants, and incantations were used as an active defense against bad dreams. In ancient Mesopotamia, specific ritual incantations against nightmare demons have survived on clay tablets, meant to be recited before sleep as a kind of verbal shield. Some of these texts are remarkably specific, naming the demons believed responsible and commanding them directly to leave. In ancient Rome, people would sometimes recite protective phrases to the goddess Nox or invoke other deities associated with night and sleep, asking for safe passage through the darkness until morning. In parts of Northern Europe, a specific nursery rhyme-style prayer, roughly translating to asking for 4 angels to watch over the bed at each corner, was recited by both children and adults for centuries, a practice so enduring that variations of it survived well into the 19th and even 20th centuries in some families. There's something genuinely clever hiding inside all of this. Reciting a fixed, familiar phrase before sleep every single night is, whether ancient people understood it this way or not, a form of ritual and routine. And modern sleep science tells us that consistent pre-sleep routines are one of the most effective tools we have for actually reducing nightmares and improving sleep quality. 5. The physical response. Rituals of the body. It wasn't only about words and objects. Many ancient cultures also built physical rituals into their nightly routines specifically to prevent or process nightmares. In some ancient Chinese traditions, sleeping positions were taken very seriously, believed to affect the flow of vital energy, or kuai, through the body during sleep. Certain positions were thought to leave a person more vulnerable to disturbing dreams, while others were considered protective. In ancient Rome and Greece, some people practiced specific breathing exercises or brief meditative rituals before bed, intended to calm a restless mind. Not entirely different in spirit from the breathing exercises a modern sleep therapist might recommend today. Perhaps most strikingly, several ancient and indigenous cultures around the world independently developed practices remarkably similar to what modern psychology now calls image rehearsal therapy. A technique where a person suffering from recurring nightmares consciously reimagines the dream with a different, less frightening ending while awake. Some indigenous Australian and North American traditions include storytelling practices where a person shares their nightmare with an elder or the community the next morning, and together they reframe or rewrite the ending, a practice that modern clinical research has since validated as genuinely effective for reducing nightmare frequency. We tend to imagine ancient humans as helpless against the terrors of the night, cowering in the dark with no real defense against whatever their minds conjured up while they slept. But that's not really what the evidence shows. They built dream dictionaries, they carved protective figures, they wove dream catchers, whispered protective prayers, and retold their nightmares by firelight until the fear lost its grip. In their own way, without any of our modern tools, they were already doing real psychological work, turning helplessness into ritual, and ritual into a genuine sense of control. Maybe the biggest difference between then and now isn't that we've solved the nightmare. It's that we've just changed the shape of the ritual we use to face it. Have you ever had a nightmare you still remember years later? What do you think it meant? Let me know in the comments below. And if this gave you a new way to think about your own dreams, subscribe for more deep dives into how ancient humans actually lived.